If the unbeliever says to you, there's no evidence that God exists, you should look at him with wide eyes and an open mouth and say, is that what you think? Well, I can think of at least 5 good arguments for God's existence. And then at that point, he's got to say, yeah, like what? And then boom, you're off and running. The question is self-contradictory. It's incoherent. It says the larger group's cumulative, subjective morality is what dictates the group's objective morality. That's self-contradictory. If it is a subjective morality that the group has decided on, then it's not an objective morality, even if they are deluded in thinking that it does. Thank you so much. It is thrilling to me to know that you are here tonight because you believe in the importance of being trained in apologetics. And I've been asked to focus this evening particularly on that division of apologetics that deals with arguments for the existence of God. In our secular culture, I believe that it is vitally important that Christians be able to defend their belief in God. As a professional philosopher, I think that there are a number of good arguments for the existence of God, whereby a good argument, I mean an argument that makes its conclusion more probable than not. And tonight I want to share with you 5 such arguments. Now, in order to make these arguments easy to understand, I'm going to be showing some animated videos that we've developed at Reasonable Faith and which are available free of charge for downloading on your mobile device at our website, reasonablefaith.org. My goal is that when you walk out of here tonight, you will have in hand 5 arguments for God's existence that you can share with unbelievers. So, are you ready? Let's go. Argument number 1 is the argument from contingency. This argument holds that God makes sense of why anything at all exists. This is the most fundamental question of philosophy. Why is there something rather than nothing? Why does anything at all exist? The great German philosopher G.W. Leibniz came to the conclusion that the answer to that question is to be found not in the universe of contingent things, but in God. God exists necessarily and is the explanation why anything else exists. And the following video explains Leibniz's reasoning.
We live in an amazing universe. Have you ever wondered why it exists? Why does anything at all exist? Gottfried Leibniz wrote, the first question which should rightly be asked is, why is there something rather than nothing? He came to the conclusion that the explanation is found in God. But is this reasonable? Everything that exists has an explanation of its existence. If the universe has an explanation of its existence, that explanation is God. The universe exists. From these, it follows logically that the explanation of the universe's existence is God. The logic of this argument is airtight. If the 3 premises are true, the conclusion is unavoidable. But are they more plausibly true than false? The third premise is undeniable for anyone seeking truth. But what about the first premise? Why not say, the universe is just there, and that's all? No explanation needed. End of discussion. Well, Imagine you and a friend are hiking in the woods and come across a shiny sphere lying on the ground. You would, naturally, wonder how it came to be there. And you'd think it odd if your friend said, "There's no reason or explanation for it. Stop wondering. It just is." And if the ball were larger, it would still require an explanation. In fact, if the ball were the size of the universe, the change in its size wouldn't remove the need for an explanation. Indeed, curiosity about the existence of the universe seems scientific and intuitive. Someone might say, if everything that exists needs an explanation, what about God? Doesn't he need an explanation? And if God doesn't need an explanation, then why does the universe need an explanation? To address this, Leibniz makes a key distinction between things that exist necessarily and things that exist contingently. Things that exist necessarily exist by necessity of their own nature. It's impossible for them not to exist. Many mathematicians think that abstract objects like numbers and sets exist like this. They're not caused to exist by something else, they just exist by necessity of their own nature. Things that exist contingently are caused to exist by something else. Most of the things we're familiar with exist contingently. They don't have to exist. They only exist because something else caused them to exist. If your parents had never met, you wouldn't exist. There's no reason to think the world around us had to exist. If the universe had developed differently, there might have been no stars or planets. It's logically possible that the whole universe might not have existed. It doesn't exist necessarily, it exists contingently. If the universe might not have existed, why does it exist? The only adequate explanation for the existence of a contingent universe is that its existence rests on a non-contingent being, something that cannot not exist because of the necessity of its own nature. It would exist no matter what. So, everything that exists has an explanation of its existence, either in the necessity of its own nature or in an external cause. But what about our second premise? Is it reasonable to call the explanation of the universe God? Well, what is the universe? It's all of space-time reality, including all matter and energy. It follows that if the universe has a cause of its existence, that cause cannot be part of the universe. It must be non-physical and immaterial, beyond space and time. The list of entities that could possibly fit this description is fairly short, and abstract objects cannot cause anything. Leibniz's contingency argument shows that the explanation for the existence of the universe can be found only in the existence of God. Or, if you prefer not to use the term God, you may simply call him the extremely powerful, uncaused, necessarily existing, non-contingent, non-physical, immaterial, eternal being who created the entire universe and everything in it.
Here once more are the premises of Leibniz's argument. Number one, everything that exists has an explanation of its existence, either in the necessity of its own nature or in an external cause. Two, if the universe has an explanation of its existence, that explanation is God. Three, the universe exists, from which it follows, four, therefore the explanation of the existence of the universe is God. Now, according to premise one, there are two kinds of things. Things that exist by a necessity of their own nature, and things that are produced by some external cause. Let me explain. Things that exist by a necessity of their own nature exist necessarily. It's impossible for them not to exist. Philosophers call such things metaphysically necessary beings. Examples? Well, many mathematicians think that numbers, sets, and other mathematical entities exist in this way. By contrast, things that are caused to exist by something else don't exist by a necessity of their own nature. They exist because something else has produced them. If their causes were removed, then they would not exist. Examples? Familiar physical objects such as people, planets, and galaxies belong in this category. So when Leibniz says that everything that exists has an explanation of its existence, that explanation may be found either in the necessity of its own nature or else in some external cause. So, what is the explanation of the existence of the universe? Where by the universe, I mean all of physical reality. It can only be found in an external cause which transcends the universe. Since it's not part of the universe of contingent things, this cause must exist by a necessity of its own nature. So if the universe has an explanation of its existence, there must be a metaphysically necessary, immaterial being beyond space and time. Now, there are only two candidates that could fit that description. Either an abstract object, like a number, or else an unembodied mind or consciousness. But abstract objects can't cause anything. That's part of what it means to be abstract. The number 7, for example, can't cause any effects. So it follows logically that the cause of the universe must be a transcendent mind, which is what God is. So I hope you grasp the power of Leibniz's argument. If successful, it proves the existence of a metaphysically necessary, uncaused, timeless, spaceless, immaterial, personal cause of the universe. This is truly mind-boggling. Our next argument is the temporal version of the cosmological argument, which holds that God makes sense of the origin of the universe. Have you ever asked yourself where the universe came from? Well, typically atheists have said that the universe is just eternal, and that's all. But is that plausible? Our next video explains how the scientific evidence for the origin of the universe points beyond the universe to its personal creator.
Does God exist? Or is the material universe all that is, or ever was, or ever will be? One approach to answering this question is the cosmological argument. It goes like this: whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore, the universe has a cause. Is the first premise true? Let's consider. Believing that something can pop into existence without a cause is more of a stretch than believing in magic. At least with magic, you've got a hat and a magician. And if something can come into being from nothing, then why don't we see this happening all the time? No, everyday experience and scientific evidence confirm our first premise. If something begins to exist, it must have a cause. But what about our second premise? Did the universe begin, or has it always existed? Atheists have typically said that the universe has been here forever. The universe is just there, and that's all. First, let's consider the second law of thermodynamics. It tells us the universe is slowly running out of usable energy, and that's the point. If the universe had been here forever, it would have run out of usable energy by now. The second law points us to a universe that has a definite beginning. This is further confirmed by a series of remarkable scientific discoveries. In 1915, Albert Einstein presented his general theory of relativity. This allowed us, for the first time, to talk meaningfully about the past history of the universe. Next, Alexander Friedmann and George Lemaitre, each working with Einstein's equations, predicted that the universe is expanding. Then in 1929, Edwin Hubble measured the red shift in light from distant galaxies. This empirical evidence confirmed not only that the universe is expanding, but that it sprang into being from a single point in the finite past. It was a monumental discovery, almost beyond comprehension. However, not everyone is fond of a finite universe, so it wasn't long before alternative models popped into existence. But one by one, these models failed to stand the test of time. More recently, three leading cosmologists, Arvind Borde, Alan Guth, and Alexander Vilenkin, proved that any universe which has on average been expanding throughout its history cannot be eternal in the past, but must have an absolute beginning. This even applies to the multiverse, if there is such a thing. This means that scientists can no longer hide behind a past eternal universe. There is no escape. They have to face the problem of a cosmic beginning. Any adequate model must have a beginning, just like the standard model. It's quite plausible then that both premises of the argument are true. This means that the conclusion is also true. The universe has a cause. And since the universe can't cause itself, its cause must be beyond the space-time universe. It must be spaceless, timeless, immaterial, uncaused, and unimaginably powerful, much like God. The cosmological argument shows that, in fact, it is quite reasonable to believe that God does exist.
So here again are the three simple premises of this argument. 1, whatever begins to exist has a cause. 2, the universe began to exist, from which it follows 3, therefore the universe has a cause. In one of the most startling developments of modern science, we now have pretty strong evidence that the universe is not eternal in the past, but had an absolute beginning about 14 billion years ago in a cataclysmic event known as the Big Bang. As explained in the video, in 2003, Arvind Borde, Alan Guth, and Alexander Vilenkin were able to show that any universe which is on average in a state of cosmic expansion throughout its history cannot be infinite in the past, but must have a beginning. And that goes for multiverse scenarios too. In 2012, Vilenkin showed that models which do not meet this one condition still fail for other reasons to avert the beginning of the universe. Vilenkin concluded, and I quote, "None of these scenarios can actually be past eternal. All the evidence we have says that the universe had a beginning." The Borde-Guth-Vilenkin theorem proves that classical space-time under a single very general condition cannot be extended to past infinity, but must reach a boundary at some time in the finite past. Now, Either there was something on the other side of that boundary or not. If not, then that boundary just is the beginning of the universe. If there was something on the other side, then it will be a region described by the yet-to-be-discovered theory of quantum gravity. In that case, Vilenkin says, it will be the beginning of the universe. Either way, the universe began to exist. Now, the video mentions scientific evidence for the universe's beginning, but there are also philosophical reasons to think that the universe began to exist. Just think about it for a minute. If the universe never had a beginning, that means that the number of events in the past history of the universe is infinite. But how could an infinite number of past events elapse one after another in order for today to arrive? That would be like trying to count down all the negative numbers ending at 0. That seems to be an absurd task. For before you could count any number, you would already have to have counted an infinite number of numbers already. And if you could count down from infinity, then why did you finish only today? Why not yesterday? Or the day before that? At any point in the past, you will already have had an infinite amount of time to finish your countdown, and therefore you should already be done. These sorts of absurdities show that an actually infinite past is impossible. And our next video explains these philosophical arguments.
Did the universe have a beginning? Or has it existed from eternity past? If it did have a beginning, this raises a question. Did the universe have a creator? In part 1, we explored this question scientifically. Now let's look at it philosophically. Aristotle believed the universe was eternal in the past. But Al-Ghazali disagreed. He pointed out that if the universe did not have a beginning, then the number of past events in the history of the universe is infinite. But that's a problem, because the existence of an actually infinite number of past events leads to absurdity. It's metaphysically impossible. Why? The mathematician David Hilbert illustrates the problem by imagining a hotel with an infinite number of rooms, all of which are occupied. There's not a single vacancy. Every room in the infinite hotel is full. Now suppose a new guest shows up and asks for a room. The manager says, sure, no problem, then moves the guest who was in room number 1 to room number 2, and the guest who was in room number 2 to room number 3, and so on to infinity. As a result of this shuffling, room number 1 becomes vacant, and the new guest happily checks in, even though all the rooms were already full, and nobody has checked out. And it gets even more absurd. Suppose an infinity of new guests show up at the front desk. No problem, says the manager. Then she moves each person into a room with a number twice that of his own room. So the person who was in room number 1 moves into room number 2. The person who was in 2 moves to 4. The person who was in 3 moves to 6, and so on. Since any number multiplied by 2 is always an even number, all the odd-numbered rooms become vacant, and the infinity of new guests gratefully check in. And yet, before they arrived, all the rooms were already full. It gets even crazier when the guests start to check out. Suppose all the guests in the odd-numbered rooms check out. In that case, an infinite number of people have left the hotel. And yet, there are no fewer people in the hotel. But suppose instead, all the guests in rooms numbered 4 and above check out. In that case, only 3 people are left. And yet exactly the same number of people left the hotel this time as when all the odd-numbered guests checked out. Thus, we have a contradiction. We subtract identical quantities from identical quantities and get different answers. These absurdities show that an actually infinite number of things cannot exist in the real world. Here is a second argument Ghazali offers against a past eternal universe. Suppose that for every one orbit Saturn completes around the Sun, Jupiter completes 2. The longer they orbit, the further Saturn falls behind. Now, what if these 2 planets have always been orbiting the Sun from eternity past? Which has completed the most orbits? Strangely enough, the number of their orbits is exactly the same, infinity. But that seems absurd, for the longer they orbit, the greater the difference becomes. If the universe has always existed, then an infinite series of past events has been formed by adding one event after another. It's like a sequence of dominoes, falling one after another until the last domino, today, is reached. The problem is that the final domino could never fall if an infinite number of dominoes had to fall first. So today could never be reached. But obviously, here we are. It's today. So the number of events leading up to today could not possibly be infinite. The infinite is nowhere to be found
in reality. It neither exists in nature nor provides a legitimate basis for rational thought. The role that remains for the infinite to play
is solely that of an idea. What objections might be raised to these arguments? Some people object that, unlike the rooms in Hilbert's hotel, the events of the past don't all exist at the same time. But we can easily tweak the story to get rid of this objection. Suppose the hotel has been under construction from eternity past, one room being added each year. How many rooms would there now be in the hotel? An actual infinite number. So if the past is infinite, that would imply that Hilbert's hotel could exist, which is absurd. Others have objected that an actually infinite number of things do exist, namely numbers and other mathematical entities. However, this objection presupposes that numbers really exist, but this is a highly disputed assumption that most philosophers reject. So if Ghazali's 2 arguments are right, then the universe is not eternal in the past. It must have a beginning. And we know intuitively that whatever begins to exist requires a cause of its existence. Thus, we are led to conclude that the universe has a cause of its existence. So what caused the universe? Atheist Daniel Dennett says, the universe caused itself. But this is incoherent, because in order to cause itself to come into existence, the universe would have to exist before it existed. The cause of the universe must therefore be outside of the universe, spaceless, timeless, immaterial, and enormously powerful. Much like God.
Since something cannot come into being from nothing, the absolute beginning of the universe implies the existence of a beginningless, uncaused, timeless, spaceless, changeless, immaterial, enormously powerful, personal creator of the universe. That takes us to our next argument, which is misspelled on your handout. This is the teleological argument, not the theological argument, the teleological argument. And the contemporary version of this argument holds that God makes sense of the fine-tuning of the universe for intelligent life. In recent decades, scientists have been stunned by the discovery that the existence of intelligent life, like ours, depends upon a complex and delicate balance of initial conditions simply given in the Big Bang itself. Scientists once believed that whatever the initial conditions of the universe, eventually intelligent life might evolve somewhere. But we now know that our existence is balanced on a razor's edge. The existence of intelligent life anywhere in the cosmos depends upon a conspiracy of initial conditions which must be fine-tuned to an accuracy that is literally incomprehensible and incalculable. The following video explains how this remarkable fine-tuning points to an intelligent designer of the universe.
From galaxies and stars, down to atoms and subatomic particles, the very structure of our universe is determined by these numbers. These are the fundamental constants and quantities of the universe. Scientists have come to the shocking realization that each of these numbers has been carefully dialed to an astonishingly precise value, a value that falls within an exceedingly narrow, life-permitting range. If any one of these numbers were altered by even a hair's breadth, no physical, interactive life of any kind could exist anywhere. There'd be no stars, no life, no planets, no chemistry. Consider gravity, for example. The force of gravity is determined by the gravitational constant. If this constant varied by just 1 in 10 to the 60th parts, none of us would exist. To understand how exceedingly narrow this life-permitting range is, imagine a dial divided into 10 to the 60th increments. To get a handle on how many tiny points on the dial this is, compare it to the number of cells in your body, or the number of seconds that have ticked by since time began. If the gravitational constant had been out of tune by just one of these infinitesimally small increments, the universe would either have expanded and thinned out so rapidly that no stars could form and life couldn't exist, or it would have collapsed back on itself with the same result: no stars, no planets, and no life. Or consider the expansion rate of the universe. This is driven by the cosmological constant. A change in its value by a mere 1 part in 10 to the 120th parts would cause the universe to expand too rapidly or too slowly. In either case, the universe would again be life-prohibiting. Or another example of fine-tuning. If the mass and energy of the early universe were not evenly distributed to an incomprehensible precision of 1 part in 10 to the 10 to the 123rd, the universe would be hostile to life of any kind. The fact is, our universe permits physical, interactive life only because these, and many other numbers, have been independently and exquisitely balanced on a razor's edge. Wherever physicists look, they see examples of fine-tuning. The remarkable fact is that the values of these numbers seem to have been very finely adjusted to make possible the development of life. If anyone claims not to be surprised by the special features that the universe has, he's hiding his head in the sand. These special features are surprising and unlikely. What is the best explanation for this astounding phenomenon? There are 3 live options. The fine-tuning of the universe is due to either physical necessity, chance, or design. Which of these options is the most plausible? According to this alternative, the universe must be life-permitting. The precise values of these constants and quantities could not be otherwise. But is this plausible? Is a life-prohibiting universe impossible? Far from it. It's not only possible, it's far more likely than a life-permitting universe. The constants and quantities are not determined by the laws of nature. There's no reason or evidence to suggest that fine-tuning is necessary. How about chance? Did we just get really, 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 really lucky? No. The probabilities involved are so ridiculously remote as to put the fine-tuning well beyond the reach of chance. So, in an effort to keep this option alive, some have gone beyond empirical science and opted for a more speculative approach, known as the multiverse. They imagine a universe generator that cranks out such a vast number of universes that, odds are, life-permitting universes will eventually pop out. However, there's no scientific evidence for the existence of this multiverse. It cannot be detected, observed, measured, or proved. And the universe generator itself would require an enormous amount of fine-tuning. Furthermore, small patches of order are far more probable than big ones. So the most probable observable universe would be a small one, inhabited by a single, simple observer. But what we actually observe is the very thing that we should least expect: a vast, spectacularly complex, highly ordered universe, inhabited by billions of other observers. So even if the multiverse existed, which is a moot point, it wouldn't do anything to explain the fine-tuning. Given the implausibility of physical necessity or chance, the best explanation for why the universe is fine-tuned for life may very well be it was designed that way. A common-sense interpretation of the facts suggests that a superintellect monkeyed with physics, and that there are no blind forces worth speaking about in nature. The numbers one calculates from the facts seem to me so overwhelming as to put this conclusion almost beyond question. There is for me powerful evidence that there is something going on behind it all. It seems as though somebody has fine-tuned nature's numbers to make the universe. The impression of design is overwhelming. The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. Day after day they pour forth speech. Night after night they reveal knowledge.
The examples of fine-tuning in the video are all up to date, accurate, and well established. Now, it's important to keep in mind here that the term fine-tuned does not mean designed. The expression is a neutral term, which just means that the range of life-permitting values for the fundamental constants and quantities of nature is extremely narrow. If the value of even one of these constants or quantities were to be altered by less than a hair's breadth, the delicate balance required for the existence of life would be upset, and the universe would be life prohibiting instead. Fine-tuning in this neutral sense is well established. The question then that we face is, what is the best explanation of the cosmic fine-tuning? There are three live options in the contemporary literature on fine-tuning: physical necessity, chance, or design. Accordingly, we can argue as follows. 1, the fine-tuning of the universe is due to either physical necessity, chance, or design. 2, it is not due to physical necessity or chance, from which it follows 3, therefore it is due to design. As the video explains, the only serious alternative to design is the multiverse chance hypothesis. And there are multiple problems with this hypothesis, but let me just highlight one of the most important. If our universe were just a random member of a multiverse, then we ought to be observing a much different universe than we do. In fact, the most probable observable universe is one which consists of a single brain, which pops into existence by a random fluctuation with illusory perceptions of the external world. So if you accept the multiverse explanation, you're obligated to believe that you are all that exists, and that this auditorium, these people, the earth, your body, everything you perceive in the world are just illusions of your brain. No sane person believes such a thing. On atheism, therefore, it is highly improbable that there exists a randomly ordered multiverse. Ironically, the best hope for fans of the multiverse is to maintain that God created it and has ordered its worlds so that they are not randomly ordered. God could give preference to observable worlds which are cosmically fine-tuned. To be rationally acceptable, the multiverse hypothesis needs God. With the failure of the multiverse hypothesis, the alternative of chance collapses. Neither physical necessity nor chance provides a good explanation for the fine-tuning of the universe. So, there we have three very compelling arguments for the existence of a creator and designer of the universe. Leibniz's argument from contingency, the temporal version of the cosmological argument, and the teleological argument from fine-tuning. After our break, we'll come back and look at two more arguments for the existence of God. Well, we come to the fourth argument now, the moral argument, which contends that God makes sense of objective moral values and duties in the world. And the following video makes this argument very clear.
Can you be good without God? Let's find out. Absolutely astounding. There you have it. Undeniable proof that you can be good without believing in God. But wait, the question isn't, can you be good without believing in God? The question is, can you be good without God? See, here's the problem. If there is no God, what basis remains for objective good or bad, right or wrong? If God does not exist, objective moral values do not exist. And here's why. Without some objective reference point, we have no way of saying that something is really up or down. God's nature provides an objective reference point for moral values. It's the standard against which all actions and decisions are measured. But if there's no God, there's no objective reference point. All we're left with is one person's viewpoint, which is no more valid than anyone else's viewpoint. This kind of morality is subjective, not objective. It's like a preference for strawberry ice cream. The preference is in the subject, not the object. So it doesn't apply to other people. In the same way, subjective morality applies only to the subject. It's not valid or binding for anyone else. So, in a world without God, there can be no evil and no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. God has expressed his moral nature to us as commands. These provide the basis for moral duties. For example, God's essential attribute of love is expressed in his command to love your neighbor as yourself. This command provides a foundation upon which we can affirm the objective goodness of generosity, self-sacrifice, and equality. And we can condemn as objectively evil greed, abuse, and discrimination. This raises a problem. Is something good just because God wills it, or does God will something because it is good? The answer is neither one. Rather, God wills something because he is good. God is the standard of moral values, just as a live musical performance is the standard for a high-fidelity recording.
Without your love.
The more a recording sounds like the original, the better it is. Likewise, the more closely a moral action conforms to God's nature, the better it is. But if atheism is true, there is no ultimate standard. So there can be no moral obligations or duties. Who or what lays such duties upon us? No one. Remember, for the atheist, humans are just accidents of nature, highly evolved animals. But animals have no moral obligations to one another. When a cat kills a mouse, it hasn't done anything morally wrong. The cat's just being a cat. If God doesn't exist, we should view human behavior in the same way. No action should be considered morally right or wrong. But the problem is, good and bad, right and wrong, do exist. Just as our sense experience convinces us that the physical world is objectively real, our moral experience convinces us that moral values are objectively real. Every time you say, "Hey, that's not fair, that's wrong, that's an injustice," you affirm your belief in the existence of objective morals. We're well aware that child abuse, racial discrimination, and terrorism are wrong for everybody, always. Is this just a personal preference or opinion? No. The man who says that it is morally acceptable to rape little children is just as mistaken as the man who says 2 + 2 = 5. What all this amounts to, then, is a moral argument for the existence of God. If God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. But objective moral values and duties do exist. Therefore, God exists. Atheism fails to provide a foundation for the moral reality every one of us experiences every day. In fact, the existence of objective morality points us directly to the existence of God.
Here, once again, are the simple premises of this argument. One, if God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. Two, objective moral values and duties do exist, from which it follows three, therefore, God exists. What makes this argument so powerful is that people generally believe both premises. In our pluralistic age, students are scared to death of imposing their values on someone else. Therefore, they at least give lip service to relativism. So premise one seems correct to them. At the same time, however, certain values have been deeply instilled into them, such as tolerance, open-mindedness, and love. In particular, they think it's objectively wrong to impose your values on someone else. And so they're deeply committed to premise two as well. They've just never connected the dots. Now, perhaps the most important thing to keep in mind in sharing the moral argument is not to confuse moral ontology with moral epistemology. Now, what do I mean by that? Moral ontology has to do with the objective reality of moral values and duties. Moral epistemology has to do with how we come to know moral values and duties. The moral argument has nothing to say about moral epistemology. It is wholly about moral ontology, the grounding of objective moral values and duties in reality. But people inevitably confuse the two. For example, some people will think that you're claiming that in order to recognize objective moral values and duties, you have to believe in God. Others will say that our moral beliefs can be explained as a result of socio-biological conditioning. Both of these objections are irrelevant to the argument. You're not saying that in order to recognize objective moral values and duties, you have to believe in God. Rather, you're saying that God has to exist in order for there to be objective moral values and duties. And as for the origin of our moral beliefs, you're not denying the influence of sociobiological conditioning upon our moral beliefs. The sociobiological account at best shows how our perceptions of moral values and duties has evolved. But if moral values are gradually discovered, not invented, then our gradual and fallible perception of those values no more undermines their objective reality than our gradual, fallible perception of the physical world undermines its objective reality. The argument makes no claim about how we come to know objective moral values and duties, and so these epistemological objections are not relevant. From the two premises, it follows logically that God exists. The moral argument complements the cosmological and design arguments by telling us something about the moral nature of the creator and designer of the universe. It gives us a personal, necessarily existing being who is not only perfectly good, but whose very nature is the standard of goodness and whose commands constitute our moral duties. Finally, number 5, the very possibility of God's existence implies that God exists. And our final video explains this surprising claim.
In the year 1078, a monk named Anselm of Canterbury astonished the world by arguing that if it is even possible that God exists, then it follows logically that God does exist. Anselm's argument came to be called the ontological argument, and it has sharply divided philosophers ever since. The 19th century German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer called it a charming joke, but many prominent 20th century philosophers, such as Charles Hartshorne, Norman Malcolm, and Alvin Plantinga, think that it's sound. Here it is. God can be defined as a maximally great being. If something were greater than God, then that being would be God. And in order to be maximally great, a maximally great being would have to be all-powerful, all-knowing, and morally perfect in every possible world. Possible worlds are simply ways the world could have been. To say that something exists in a possible world is just to say that if the world were that way, then the thing would have existed. For example, even though unicorns don't exist in the actual world, it seems at least possible that they could have. So we can say that unicorns exist in some possible world. On the other hand, a married bachelor does not exist in any possible world because the idea of a married bachelor is logically incoherent. It could not possibly exist. So if it is possible that a maximally great being exists, then we can say that he exists in some possible world. But wait, a maximally great being would not really be maximally great if it existed in only some possible worlds. To be maximally great, it has to be all-powerful, all-knowing, and morally perfect in every possible world. So think about it. If a maximally great being exists in any possible world, then it exists in every possible world. And if it exists in every possible world, then it exists in the actual world. That is, a maximally great being actually exists. Thus, the atheist has to maintain not simply that God does not exist, but that it is impossible that God exists. Here's a summary of the ontological argument. Steps 2 through 6 are straightforward and largely uncontroversial. But what about point number 1? Clearly, if it can be shown that the idea of a God is logically incoherent, then the argument fails. But is the idea of a maximally great being absurd, like a married bachelor or a square circle or the smell of blue? This doesn't seem to be the case. The notion of an all-powerful, all-knowing, morally perfect being that exists in every possible world seems to be a perfectly coherent idea. But couldn't we parody this argument and make it work for anything? Why not say, it's logically possible that a maximally great pizza exists. Therefore, a maximally great pizza does exist? However, the idea of a maximally great pizza is not like the idea of a maximally great being. In the first place, there aren't intrinsic maximal values that make pizzas great. There could always be one more pepperoni to increase its greatness. It's not even obvious what properties make a pizza great. Thin crust or thick crust, extra cheese, anchovies? It's relative to the taste of the consumer. In the second place, a maximally great pizza would have to exist in every logical possible world. But that would mean that it couldn't be eaten. So it wouldn't really be a pizza, because a pizza is something you can eat. The idea of a maximally great pizza turns out not to be a coherent idea. The idea of God, on the other hand, is an intuitively coherent idea. Therefore, his existence is a possibility. And the ontological argument shows that if God possibly exists, then God actually exists.
Well, now the premises of that argument went by pretty fast, so here they are again. And I notice on the handout, I use the expression greatest conceivable being rather than maximally great being. These are intended to be synonymous. And in the video, it uses, I think, the locution maximally great being, which is better than greatest conceivable being. So let me run the premises by you as they were in the video. Number one, it is possible that a maximally great being, aka God, exists. Two, if it is possible that a maximally great being exists, then a maximally great being exists in some possible world. Three, if a maximally great being exists in some possible world, then it exists in every possible world. Four, if a maximally great being exists in every possible world, then it exists in the actual world. Five, if a maximally great being exists in the actual world, then a maximally great being exists. Six, therefore, a maximally great being exists. Seven, therefore, God exists. Now, as the video explains, premises 2 to 7 are uncontroversial. The whole argument hangs on premise 1. Is it possible that God exists? And I like to simply leave this question open for the unbeliever to think about. You don't need to prove to him that it's possible that God exists. Just let him think about it. The mere conclusion that if it's possible that God exists, then God does exist is enough to give the atheist or agnostic serious food for thought. Now, the 5 arguments that I've shared with you this evening present a powerful cumulative case for the existence of God. Together, they yield a metaphysically necessary, uncaused, transcendent, immaterial, personal, creator and designer of the universe, who is the paradigm and source of absolute moral goodness. I'd like to close tonight with some practical suggestions about using these arguments in everyday conversations with an unbeliever. Non-believers are not used to running into Christians who can actually give reasons for what they believe. And therefore, they tend to simply rest with slogans like, there's no evidence that God exists. And that becomes an effective conversation stopper for most Christians. But if you have these arguments in hand, rather than a conversation stopper, that becomes a conversation starter. If the unbeliever says to you, there's no evidence that God exists, you should look at it with wide eyes and an open mouth and say, is that what you think? Well, I can think of at least 5 good arguments for God's existence. And then at that point, he's got to say, yeah, like what? And then boom, you're off and running. God is the best explanation for why anything at all exists. God is the best explanation for the origin of the universe. God is the best explanation of the fine-tuning of the universe for intelligent life. God is the best explanation of objective moral values and duties in the world. And the very possibility of God's existence proves that God exists. Even if you don't have the arguments memorized, just being able to list the arguments is often enough to satisfy the unbeliever. I have found that just being able to list the arguments puts you far beyond the average Christian that the unbeliever has ever met. Now, if the unbeliever does have further questions and wants you to explain further, then share with him the premises of the argument. As we've seen, these arguments can be very simply formulated and are easy to memorize. A junior high school student can memorize these arguments. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. If God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. But objective moral values and duties do exist. Therefore, God exists. These are simple, easily memorizable arguments. And having the premises memorized will help you to keep the conversation with an unbeliever on track. If the unbeliever starts to stray off track by getting into other subjects, just say to him politely, well, now, if you think that my conclusions are false, you must think that at least one of my premises is false. So, which premise do you reject and why? Focus on the premises. And if the unbeliever wants to go still deeper, then go with him. All of these arguments are further explained in my book, On Guard, which is a sort of Swiss Army knife for training in apologetics. It will enable you to explain each argument and to answer the typical objections that are raised against them. And then, of course, it's my hope that you'll go to reasonablefaith.org on your mobile device and watch the video with your unbelieving friend and start a conversation with him. So, the arguments presented here constitute a powerful cumulative case for the existence of God. I hope that as you share the gospel with people, that these arguments might be useful in reaching out to atheists and agnostics in order to open their minds to belief in God. I look forward to your questions.
All right, let's go ahead and jump in. Thank you so much for that. It's been amazing. And I am so glad that you are here to answer all these questions. There's some great ones that have come in.
Good.
And I'm excited for a few of these to have the space to be asked. You know, I think it's an awesome thing that there's a space for questions to be asked. So can I just hold up your book this book one time?
Okay.
I'm gonna I love the subtitle of this book, Defending Your Faith with Reason and Precision. I love that. This book is a great resource I would highly recommend to you, called On Guard. You can get it anywhere. and I would really recommend it to you. I think that all of us as believers, we need to be prepared to give a defense for our faith that has both reason and precision. That's pretty awesome. All right, let's jump in. We're going to get to as many of them as we can in 25 minutes and 48 seconds. There were a lot.
Can I look on with you and see the questions?
Sure. Is that cheating? Is everybody okay with that? Just teasing. So this first one, I'm trying to prioritize questions that were asked multiple times. There were a lot of questions. Really, these first two kind of clumped into one. I'll read them, and then I'll give you some space to answer them. Let me read both of these together because they kind of fit in one camp, and it was probably the most frequently asked question. If God can exist without cause, then why not the universe itself? Second question, if everything has an explanation for existence and the creation of the universe is because of God, then couldn't an argument be made that something else could have created God? If whatever begins to exist has a cause, what caused God to exist?
Let's talk about the second question first. Something else could not have created God because God, by definition, is an eternal being and therefore never began to exist. So he couldn't have a cause. Now, certainly there could be a finite being that created our universe, say Zeus or Jupiter or something like that. But then that would be a contingent being that would also need an explanation of its existence. And so really, it would be part of the universe of contingent things. So that leads us to the first question. If God can exist without a cause, why not the universe itself? And the answer would be, well, in order for the universe to exist without a cause, it would have to be a metaphysically necessary being. And that just doesn't seem to be correct. The universe is composed of contingent things that didn't have to exist, and the universe itself doesn't seem to be metaphysically necessary. The universe could have failed to exist, and this is especially obvious by the fact that it did have a beginning. If it had a beginning, then that means it doesn't exist necessarily. It came into being. So I don't think that the argument from contingency can be avoided by saying that the universe is metaphysically necessary. The universe is contingent, and this is obvious especially from its beginning. So there needs to be something beyond the universe that is non-contingent and therefore eternal, timeless, spaceless, and so forth.
Very good. That's the exact same way I would have answered that question.
Good.
This is one question that I wanted to let slip in here that's not particularly related to the topics we talked about tonight, but I think because of your experience and because of the emphasis on our church of investing in the next generation, I love this question. If you're speaking to the next generation of Christian thinkers and leaders, what single area of study or training do you believe will be the most crucial for defending the faith in the next 50 years?
I thought there might be a question like this, and my answer would be, learn the basic rules of logic. There are only about 9 rules of logic that govern all of reasoning. And if you can master these 9 rules of logic, you will be able to construct logically valid arguments like those I've shared tonight, and you will be able to spot logical fallacies in the arguments of your opponents. So how do you learn the basic rules of logic? Well, we have developed at Reasonable Faith this children's book called Learning Logic, an illustrated book that teaches the basic 9 rules of logic. And I have taught this to my own children and family. We spent one summer going through the study of these 9 rules of logic. And so I know you can do it. And this is a kind of workbook with quizzes and exams and things of that sort very, very congenial, and you can get it at Amazon.com. Just look up William Lane Craig, Learning Logic. And I think the study of logic will be the most powerful tool or training that our Christian leaders could have. Now, I'm speaking, of course, apart from spiritual issues. You know, of course, they have to have Bible knowledge and things like that. But in terms of the kind of training that they need, I think training in the rules of logic.
Great. That's awesome. Which of these arguments do you find to be the easiest to incorporate into our evangelism? You talked a little bit about practically implementing these, but lots of these questions. Where should we enter into this conversation with our neighbors? How do we begin the conversation? Where do we start? How do we use layman's terms to engage in
I
the conversation?
think that the moral argument is the easiest entree point with unbelievers. I love the cosmological argument, but I understand that that's
you're not my
where,
neighbor.
Yeah, that's not where most people live. But you see, every day you get up, you answer by how you treat other people, whether or not you think objective moral values and duties exist. Do you think that other people have intrinsic moral worth and therefore are to be treated as ends in themselves, or do you think they're merely to be used as means to your own ends? And so the question raised by the moral argument is inescapable. Do objective moral values and duties exist? Do other people have intrinsic moral worth? And if so, what is its foundation? How do you ground these on a naturalistic, atheistic worldview? So that would be a great entree point. When there are horrible atrocities, such as we've heard in the news lately, that forms an entry point for talking about evil and what grounds good and evil.
Yeah, that's great. I want to skip down here because this kind of goes into the moralistic argument. What would you say to those who argue that a larger, I'm on this one right here, that a larger group's cumulative subjective morality is what dictates the group's objective morality and sets the standard for what is moral to the whole?
Yeah, the question is self-contradictory. It's incoherent. It says the larger group's cumulative subjective morality is what dictates the group's objective morality. That's self-contradictory. If it is a subjective morality that the group has decided on, then it's not an objective morality, even if they are deluded in thinking that it does. They are just suffering under a kind of moral delusion. And this is the problem with theories of morality that say, well, it's just a social contract that we make with one another, and we sort of make up these moral values so that we can live together and so forth. In that case, the child rapist or the child abuser doesn't do anything really wrong. He's just acting unfashionably. He's not conforming to the social contract. And that, I think, cannot ground objective good and evil, right and wrong.
Yeah, great. Don't know who asked that question. What do you think is the most compelling atheistic argument against the existence of God?
I think that the argument from the hiddenness of God is the most powerful atheistic argument. God could be a lot more obvious if he wanted to.
Yep.
And yet, it seems so often that God is hidden. We cry out to him and he doesn't answer our prayers. He seems silent. And so the suspicion arises that there's really nobody out there. And so this argument from divine hiddenness, I think, is one that is very powerful. And I have a twofold response to this argument. First, I don't think that God is hidden. I think that the arguments that I've shared tonight show that there is ample evidence of the existence of God. The people who press the hiddenness of God objection inevitably think that there are no good arguments for God's existence. And so they think we're just in a sort of vacuum. We've got no reason to believe in God, and therefore God's being hidden causes them not to believe that God is there. But if you've got a good battery of positive arguments for God's existence, then that really undercuts the hiddenness of God objection. Second thing is, boy, and this gets kind of technical, is that I think God in his omniscience knows what amount of evidence would be most productive of the optimal number of people coming freely to find salvation and eternal life. And that if making his existence more obvious would have led to greater salvation, knowledge of God, then I think he would have made his existence more obvious. But he knows that this is just the right amount of evidence to provide to cause people to seek after him, to search for him, and to find him based on the good evidence that we do have. And so, given God's knowledge of the conditions that are conducive to bringing the optimal number of people to salvation freely in this world, I think that God knows how to balance just the right amount of evidence to do that.
Very good.
And so what the atheist would have to show to refute that, he would have to show that if God made his existence more obvious, that would have resulted in more people coming to know him and love him and find salvation. And I don't see any way that he could prove that. They might come to add another item to their ontological inventory of things. Say, yeah, I guess there is a God, but that doesn't mean they would fall in love with him or come to know him. Think of the people of Israel in the Old Testament. They fell away from God over and over again with tireless repetition, even though God was so manifest to them in the cloud and the fire. Mere obviousness of God's existence doesn't make people fall in love with God and come to know and worship him, which is God's goal. God's goal is not just to get people to add another item to their ontological inventory, but to find salvation. And he knows just the amount of evidence to provide in order to do that.
Yeah, it's great. You talked about, in a few of the different arguments, you talked about recent science and new discoveries. Talk a little bit, two-pronged question. What scientific discovery throughout your career has promoted or helped the Christian argument the most? Mm-hmm. And what scientific discovery throughout your career has threatened the Christian story the most?
It's really a toss-up between the discovery of the origin of the universe, which only happened during the 1920s with the development of this Friedman-Lemaitre model of an expanding universe. That changed everything. For millennia, people had always believed that the universe had always existed. It was just there. And the idea that the universe had a beginning and has not always existed was just absolutely world-changing. So that was an enormous change in the 20th century. And then rivaling it would be the discovery of the fine-tuning of the universe. This has really rocked scientists. I've seen any number of statements by non-believers saying, this is a good argument for the existence of God. Now, they might not be ready to believe in God, but they will say, yes, this is a genuinely good argument. People are really impressed with the argument from fine-tuning. And it's basically come down to the multiverse versus God. Those are the two options today, multiverse or God. And I explained some of the problems with the multiverse. Now, in terms of the other side, I'm tempted to say the theory of biological evolution, which seems to undercut human specialness and human dignity. I don't think, in fact, that the theory is incompatible with Christian belief, but I think that culturally it has been a real challenge, I think, for many people. I think probably a more serious problem would be contemporary brain science, studies of neurology and the brain, which would suggest that everything that we think or do is determined by physical stimuli and the makeup of the brain, which would preclude any room for free will and hence for human dignity. And so I think we really need Christians going into brain science. If you're a young person here today and looking for a career path, I think going into neurology or brain science will be really critical. I don't think that there's really a problem with the theory of biological evolution, but culturally there is that perception.
Yeah, very good. I hope my children are listening at home. Go into brain science, girls. Be good for me. Let's try to get to a few just specific ones in the few minutes we got left. Instead of there being a creator who fine-tuned the universe, why couldn't life have adapted itself to livable conditions?
Because there wouldn't be any life. There wouldn't be any life to adapt to anything. I don't think people appreciate the catastrophic consequences of changing the values of these constants and quantities. It's not just that maybe some other form of life would have evolved in the universe or something of that sort. It's that there wouldn't be any planets. There wouldn't be any stars. There wouldn't be any place for life to exist. There wouldn't be any chemistry. There wouldn't be matter in the absence of the fine-tuning. So the idea that life is going to exist and then adapt itself simply doesn't appreciate the catastrophic consequences of changing the values of these constants and quantities.
Great. You already talked about this one a little bit. Is it possible that our sense of morality evolved naturally through social and evolutionary pressures? Anything else you want to say about that?
I guess not, because I've already addressed it. The question is not how our moral beliefs originated. We don't need to deny the influence of sociobiological conditioning. The question is about, do we gradually and fallibly come to apprehend an objective moral realm, or do we not? And the fact that our beliefs are conditioned by biology and our parental upbringing and society does nothing to undermine the objectivity of moral values and duties.
Great. This is a very specific question, but it came in multiple times. Can you elaborate more on the definition of a self-necessary being in the contingency argument?
Yes. You know, this is so interesting because I don't think most Christians have a truly exalted concept of God. They think that God is just something that happens to exist, that he just happens to be there. He's a contingent being like we are. But the concept of God is that this is a metaphysically necessary being. That is to say, he is a being that exists by a necessity of his own nature, and therefore it is impossible for God not to exist. To put it visually, God exists in every possible world, just as the ontological argument says. And if you have trouble grasping this idea of necessary existence, then again, I would invite you to think about mathematical entities, things like numbers, sets, geometrical shapes. Mathematicians who think that these really exist will say they're not contingent, they just don't happen to exist. It's necessary that they exist. They exist necessarily. Now, I don't believe that these mathematical objects really exist. I think there's just sort of like ideas. But nevertheless, philosophers who do believe in these mathematical entities don't think that they're contingent. They believe that they are metaphysically necessary beings. So this isn't special pleading for God as a metaphysically necessary being. There are other beings that philosophers have identified as being metaphysically necessary. But the idea here is that by their own nature, they exist and therefore cannot fail to exist.
Great. Okay, one or two more. Let's say you're talking to your neighbor and you have all these arguments memorized, and they get to it, they're like, "Uncle, okay, I agree, there something, this was created. I believe that this was a creation, it has a beginning." And the next few weeks we're really talking about this, but we have you here tonight, so I'm not gonna let you get away without you maybe giving a few thoughts on this. What would be your strongest arguments if someone were to say, okay, I can see that there was a beginning, and that there was an all-powerful creator, but what is your evidence, what is your strongest evidence that that creator is the God of the Bible?
The arguments we've talked about tonight are common property of Jews, Christians, Muslims, and deists. All of us believe in a creator and designer of the universe. But what Pastor Grant is asking about is, how do you move beyond mere theism to Christian theism? And there, I think, you have to look at the person of Jesus of Nazareth. Who was this man, Jesus of Nazareth? And so ask the unbeliever, do you think that God has revealed himself to us in some way that we can know him more fully? What do you think about Jesus of Nazareth? Who was he? What did he claim? And I want to argue that Jesus' radical personal claims to divinity, whereby he put himself in the place of God himself, and which led to his crucifixion for blasphemy, have been publicly and dramatically vindicated by God's raising him from the dead. After I finished my doctoral studies in philosophy on the cosmological argument, Jan and I moved to Germany, where I did my doctoral studies in theology at the University of Munich on the historicity of the resurrection of Jesus. And I am convinced that the historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus is such that we have good grounds for believing that God has specially revealed himself in Jesus of Nazareth, and he has ratified this by raising him from the dead, thereby vindicating those allegedly blasphemous claims for which he was crucified.
Amen. We should clap for that, I think. Beautiful. So powerful. Will you tell everybody, I know you've mentioned it once or twice, tell everybody how they can get more of this content, how they can follow along with you. Where's the best place to go?
Yes, reasonablefaith.org is our website, and there are literally hundreds of thousands of pages of material there that are available free of charge. And so I would encourage you to go to the website. All of the videos are there.
Great.
We have another series of videos that are coming out by the same animator on the attributes of God, explaining who God is, what he's like. I write a weekly column on the website called Question of the Week. I do a weekly podcast with Kevin Harris, a kind of conversational program about issues of the day. I teach a weekly Sunday school class called Defenders, and those lessons are on the podcast. And then there's all of the various YouTube videos. We have multiple channels that feature lectures, debates, interviews, and so forth. So there is just an abundance of material available at reasonablefaith.org free of charge.
Amazing. You're a busy guy.
Yeah.
It's awesome. I thank God. I thank God for how He is using you in your ministry. You and Jan, thank you both for being here. It means the world to us. It's really a dream come true to have you here at CORE. And so one more time, can we just say thank you to Dr. Craig for being here to invest in our people. Grateful for you.